I want to thank Crystal for that wonderful piece on the story behind the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, which seems to encapsulate our American mania for competition and winning. And I use it today as a lead in to my discussion of competition on Super Bowl Sunday, where more than 100 million people will be tuned in to see Tom Brady versus Patrick Mahomes. And of course, one of the greatest showdowns ever. But in terms of competition, I think it probably started for all of us when we waved our hand frantically in grade school in order to answer the teacher, best the others in the class, and thus win the teacher's approval. It seems that most everyone wants to come in first at something. I enjoy paging through Guinness Book of Records. I don't know if you've ever done that, but to see what distinctions people have won. Have you ever looked at it? Persons having the greatest number of consecutive pogo stick jumps, or those having consumed the greatest number of hamburgers or pies. But I'm fascinated that even preachers get into the act. Did you know that for several years, a Unitarian Universalist minister was listed as having the longest sermon on record? Yes, indeed. It's been eclipsed now, but for several years, the late Reverend Robert Marshall from our Birmingham, Michigan church was listed as having given the longest sermon ever, 23 hours. Now, I saw Bob once at a General Assembly, and I said, how could you preach for 23 hours? He said, well, I had once given a sermon on Greek, a series of sermons on Greek thought, and I put them all together. And, I had people from my church who stayed with me for the whole 23 hours. Well, this led to some consternation among other Unitarian Universalist ministers when it got wide media attention. And there were actually signs that sprouted out in front of some of your churches across the land, which said, short sermons preached here. Of course, professional and collegiate sports dazzle us with exploits of grueling competition. And being caught up in the thrill of victory and agony of defeat, sports syndrome has become a religion for millions of Americans. But for a number of years during the post-Civil War formation of American industrial power, the dominant social philosophy was that of social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest. And so competition in business leadership and among workers was deemed to be the divinely appointed mechanism of an elite coming to prominence. Now, this, I think, was a very influential period in the history of our nation, setting the tone for succeeding developments. I think the reverberations are still apparent. William Graham Sumner, a sociologist and political economist at Yale, wrote voluminously about competition as a Darwinist. At one point, he wrote, "Poverty belongs to the struggle for existence, and we are all born into that struggle. This is a world in which the rule is root, hog, or die, and it is also a world in which the longest pole knocks down the most persimmons. To take poles away from the fit who have obtained them by their honest efforts and give to the unfit who do not know how to use them properly is to wreck society. It deprives deserving individuals of their liberty and property and destroys their incentive. We must reconcile ourselves to a situation in which some people, because of superior ability, have better poles than others, and some people, because of inherent inferiority, have no poles at all. This is just the way the world is," wrote Mr. Sumner. Well, I think that has really affected our national character and our national reticence to establish a compassionate social safety net, as have so many other nations, particularly in regards to healthcare and wages. You know that our national minimum wage on the federal level has languished at $7.25 an hour since 2009. And I heard on PBS yesterday that 1.6 million Americans worked for $7.25 an hour or less in 2019. Competition, I'm suggesting, is as American as apple pie. And perhaps we should scratch the words "in God we trust" from our currency and inscribe instead those celebrated words of Packers coach Vince Lombardi: "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing." Well, is there anything wrong with our American obsession with winning? I think there are some things wrong with it. First, in our anxiety about winning, we are likely to lose sight of the self-evident truth that in many particular situations we contrive in our society, somebody must win and somebody must lose, unless there's a tie, and we abhor ties. And even champions lose some of the time. The best in professional baseball show less than 50% success at the plate, much less than this actually. And I guess the best was the 406 that Ted Williams batted one year. But in the World Series or the Super Bowl, does the team that comes in second get reassurance from the press and the Monday morning quarterbacks that they are much better than practically all other teams in the world? I doubt it, because to be second in America is to suffer agony. I've never seen a team in second place mug the television camera with "we're number two." Have you? To be second or third is to be vanquished. It's to be defeated emotionally. And I really despise the idea of the winner-take-all mentality. And I have to criticize my favorite TV show, Jeopardy, for this reason. The winner maybe gets $20,000, $30,000. The second place and third place get $2,000 and $1,000, no matter if they have won significantly more during the contest. And I don't like that. I'm much more in favor of the Wheel of Fortune model, where whatever you win is yours to keep. But this past week, I had an idea of doing something quite interesting. I went to the records of the Professional Golfers Association to look at the relative standings as to the average strokes per game for various levels in their standings. Now, Dustin Johnson is number one. Of course, he's well known. He gets a lot of press. He won the Masters this last year. And his average strokes per game are 68.29. And second is Bryson DeChambeau at 69.20. In other words, 9/10 of a stroke less. Can you imagine that? You hardly hear about Bryson. Or Harris English, number 10, at 69.68. He's 1.39 strokes off of the winner. Can you imagine that? You hardly hear anything about him. Or number 100, his is 71.14, 2.85 strokes. Yeah, don't hear anything about him. I'd like to go up to number 10 or number 50 or number 100 and shake their hands and say, "Keep it up. Good work. You're doing a remarkable job." But of course, we don't hear about those folks. A second problem with excessive emphasis on winning or achievement of self-worth is that it can get the upper hand and lead to acts of desperation. For instance, extreme pressure on children to compete academically to be at the top of their class may lead to cheating on examinations, or lead their parents to cheat in order to get them into prestigious schools, as we've seen in the past year. Emphasis on winning at any cost led to the Nixon White House to desperate illegal acts. And of course, we've seen that play out during the past year with President Trump, leading to the desecration of our Capitol. You know, I read in the Washington Post yesterday that thus far, adding up all the costs for Trump not willing to concede the election stand at $515 million, and they're going up every day. Competition gone awry is conflict, and it occurs when individuals or groups do not merely compete for the same scarce goal, but seek to injure or even destroy each other. When the competitive drive gets too intense, it blots out our capability to enjoy the virtues of gentleness and kindness, contentment, fun, frankness, honesty, and relaxation. For a couple of years, as I began my ministry, I was camp director at Camp Unistar, our denominational camp in northern Minnesota. And we had a tradition that came much before I became director, that the staff volleyball team each week would play the campers in this family camp. And they would choose, their best players to play. And it was quite a competition. But particularly in the second year I was there, the second summer, it got very, very intense. And I remember we began hurling insults back and forth across the net. Of course, we should have had an umpire to call everything, and that was a mistake I made as a director. But it got very tough. People raising their fists at each other and yelling. And I, as the director, had to intercede. And I said, folks, this is just a game. We're not experiencing gentleness, kindness, and contentment. And they said, Johnson, go jump in the lake. But that's what can happen, of course, with competition. Now, a third problem, closely allied, is that, and I think it's a bit of a moral tragedy, that long-term physical debilities are suffered in some professional sports. Professional boxing, of course, but also professional football. Several years ago now, I read a piece by John McMurtry, a Canadian university philosophy professor who had played professional football in Canada. And he noted in this article, perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the game is that the systematic infliction of injuries incites in people not concern, as would be the case at, say, a rock festival, but a collective rejoicing and euphoria and violence to the human body. And then in this article, he relates all the injuries he had suffered in football over the years. And it's quite a list. It started off as a youngster with torn ligaments in his knee. And then they came faster and faster, broken nose, broken jaw, ripped knee ligaments again, torn ligaments in one ankle, a fracture in the other, repeated rib fractures and cartilage tears, more dislocations of the left shoulder than I can remember, occasional broken or dislocated fingers and toes, chronically hurt back. He said, I still can't lift it or change a tire without worrying about folding, separated right shoulder, and so on and so on. He said, the last pro game I played, I had a recently dislocated left shoulder, a more recently wrenched right shoulder, and a chronic pain center in one leg. I was tied up with soreness to the degree that I couldn't drive my car to the airport. But it never occurred to me or anyone else that I missed a play as a corner linebacker. And he said, by the end of my career, I learned that physical injury, giving it and taking it, is the real currency of the sport. And in the final analysis, the winner is the man who can hit to kill, even if only half his limbs are working. In brief, a war game with a warrior ethos into which, like almost everyone else I played with, my original boyish enthusiasm had been relentlessly taunted and conditioned. Wow, what an indictment of my favorite sport. Well, that, together with a devastating program by Phil Donahue on the subject and learning of widespread debilitating brain injuries sustained in the sport, called my ardor for the game with its captivating strategies, speed, and changing fortunes and dazzling exploits into question. And it ceased being my favorite sport to watch. And I turned to professional basketball with a real penchant for the Golden State Warriors and Steph Curry. But once we have exposed some of the problems of competitive striving, this insatiable need to be best, perhaps we confront another debacle. If it weren't for competition, what would supply the motivation or challenge to us if we did away with competition? Well, the answer to this problem is that excellence is not always produced by the same motivations. Some people, of course, work painstakingly and perhaps even obsessively because they must be best and suffer any consequences to be best. I think that was the case is the case with President Trump. But we also know those who work hard but seem to do so without extremely anxious effort to be a winner. They enjoy work as some enjoy a hobby. They are persons who are concerned by curiosity as to what lies around the corner of discovery. There are those who seem to work tirelessly at relieving human suffering. The point I want to make is that if we can work with joy and satisfaction toward the peak of our own ability, we need not to be concerned with the relative success of anyone else as compared to our own success. And I think such a consciousness constitutes an act of being second best or third best or fourth best, which is really an art, I think. Now, I have to admit that I have some sense of unease about decrying some of the evils of competition. As a product of American culture, I'm endued with that spirit, and at times it served me well. I remember in high school, I joined the debate team and made the varsity team, and we were able in 1962 to be the state debate champions of Wisconsin. What a great accomplishment it was. It felt great, but also what a stimulus that was to competition. Competition, what a stimulus it was to thinking and speaking clearly. I also competed, I guess, in high school in a United Nations contest and won on the US Constitution. I came in first in one and second in the other, but both of them gave me information and led to attitudes which are with me today. And I think of times where I've challenged myself and have been very satisfied with the results. I think of when I first went to the University of Minnesota Duluth as a staff person in student affairs work. I was living in faculty housing, and the fellow next door, Jerry, was a real racquetball enthusiast. And he said, Paul, why don't you come and play a game of racquetball? Well, I had never played before. I had played a little handball earlier, but a similar game, of course, racquetball, bigger ball, and a different sort of racket. And so I said yes, and he just wiped me out. I mean, I think I lost either 11-0 or 21-0. He skunked me. But, you know, I really enjoyed that game. And I said to myself, I'm going to play him in 6 months, and I'm going to win. And so I set up a deal with the Episcopalian chaplain at the university to get up with me at least 3 mornings a week, 6:30 in the morning. We hit the courts at the Y. And I practiced and I practiced and I practiced. And I began running to increase my endurance. And after 6 months, I casually mentioned to Jerry, you know, I'd kind of like to try racquetball again. And so we went to the Y and I won 22-20. And what a feeling that was. Now, I didn't want to down and degrade Jerry, but I wanted to increase my ability at something that I enjoy in terms of competition. And a little later on, I started playing racquetball with my best friend, Kerry Johnson. And he had this deal where before every serve, he would bow to me and do the namaste thing, you know. And at first I thought, well, that's just something to give him an advantage. And I said, Kerry, please, you don't have to do that. He said, no, I really would appreciate it if you would, you allowed me to do that. He said, because I want you to know that I honor you and I'm not trying to best you. I'm playing for the glory of the game and our mutual improvement. You know, and I think there was a lot of wisdom and insight and friendship in that. And then, of course, I have to say that collegiate, professional sports, and Olympic sports give me the satisfaction of viewing excellence. It's almost a religious experience to watch. Now, religions have traditionally been built upon what the Greeks called aesthesis, from which we get our word aesthetic. It means development of character through self-denial, through repetition and experiment. And the term was used by medieval Christian monks to express their drive for spiritual excellence. And this past week, I read an interesting article in Men's Health about Patrick Mahomes, the Kansas City quarterback, and his physical regimen of training. in order, to be able to pass those 50 yards passes and so forth, and to get the 10-year, $50 million contract he has with Kansas City. But it was just amazing, the diligence and the discipline, the aesthetic that he uses in order to excel the way he does. And that is very inspiring to me. If you ever have attempted to perform a sport, you realize the degree of excellence that's portrayed week after week. I've played a little basketball, a little touch football, and some tennis, and I know something of the difficulty of sports. Years ago, I read the book, The Joy of Sports by Catholic theologian Michael Novak, in which he says that to have a religion, you need to have heroic forms to live up to, patterns of excellence so high that human beings live up to them only rarely, even when they strive to do so. And images of perfection so beautiful that living up to them or seeing someone else live up to them produces a kind of awe. Now, despite some of the criticism that I've lodged against professional sports, it does give me that sense of awe. And I have to say that I've eased up on some of my feelings about professional football this season. When Tom Brady came to Florida, to Tampa Bay, after not having the best leaving with the Patriots and some concern that Bill Belichick had done him wrong, I really wanted to see Brady at age of 43 to succeed. And boy, did that ever draw me to watching the games. In fact, one of the games wasn't televised in my area, so I had to listen to it on the radio. But I was really pulling for him the whole season, as I will be today. And so finally, I'm not going to thoroughly fault competition because it's given all of us, of course, a good degree of efficiency, productivity, and economic affluence in our country. Capitalism does have its virtues in that respect. I think of that wonderful joke coming out of the Soviet Union many, many years ago, where a fellow goes into a Lada dealership to order an automobile. He's finally saved up enough money. And the salesman says to him, "Congratulations, you've made it, and we'll be able to deliver your Lada 10 years from today." And the fellow said, "Well, is that going to be in the morning or the afternoon?" And the salesman says, "Well, what difference will that make?" And the fellow said, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning." A planned economy without competition can lead to a lot of problems for consumers. And so there's much to be said for competition. Just think about how the quality of American automobiles improved immeasurably once Japanese competition came on board. But at the same time, we must continue the process that has moved us beyond social Darwinism and laissez-faire economics, where we have a regulated capitalism with provision for those who are left behind in the competitive race through no fault of their own, and one that has higher human values involved in the economic processes as well. And I'm so pleased, that President Biden plans on infrastructure projects, which will provide more well-paying jobs. I'm really impressed with wanting to improve the healthcare possibilities for all Americans. I'm much impressed also with increasing the plan to increase the minimum wage to $15. The fact of the matter is that globalization of the world economy has led to so many gains for millions of people throughout the world, but it has led to the agony of defeat for so many in our manufacturing economy. And that's why we've had suicides. That's why we have had opiate abuse. That's why we've had a lowering of longevity in so many places because of this. And so I think the work on infrastructure, the attempt to buy American, by our U.S. government and so forth, is an important plan that's underway. All in all, I'm convinced of the value of that old proverb. It's not if you win or lose, it's how you play the game that counts. And some would say, how prosaic. The statement has been ridiculed as being simply a consolation for losers, but I think there's much wisdom to it. It's just common sense to realize that in many pursuits, we can't always be winners. We vary in our natural talent. It just makes good sense in judging ourselves to take into account natural abilities and how we are living up to them as being a measure of our self-worth, not as to whether or not we are winners. I believe this so deeply that each of us has some distinctive endowment, aptitude, or quality of mind or spirit that is valuable and may be used in the service of others, as well as developed to give us a sense of accomplishment, well-being, and self-worth. In our congregation, we have so many abilities and interests that can be used in the service and to the betterment of all. The problem is that our competitive culture often rewards the glamorous winners and doesn't just bestow value on the common person's attempt to develop his or her talent, even though he or she will never stand in a winner's circle. For several years in college and graduate school, I worked at camps with children. And so often they didn't want to be part of an activity because they said, I'm no good at it. I don't know how to do it. And I think that's really sad. It seems to be operating in terms of the maximum, anything worth doing is worth winning or worth doing extremely well. And of course, I don't believe that's true. Anything worth doing is also worth doing badly, at least to start. And I trust that we teach that to ourselves and we practice it ourselves. We don't have to be winners or top flight at everything we do. And of course, I think it's important to teach kids the importance of cooperation as well as competition. And I read this last week about Cooperative Games. And one of them stands out to me because I played it as a kid. Did you ever play musical chairs? You know, each time the music stops, a chair is taken out, and so it becomes sort of cutthroat competition. And this author was saying, well, how about making sure you have sturdy chairs and then seeing how many kids you can get on each chair at each point until the final chair. And he said, that's the type of cooperation we should be instilling in kids. I thought that was very interesting. But the question comes to all of us. Do we view our achievement in terms of our own capabilities, regardless of whether or not we are winners? Do we bestow value on children and grandchildren when they strive to do their best, even though they may not be winners? Do we allow ourselves the luxury of simply enjoying some pursuit without always placing ourselves somewhere on the winner-loser continuum? And I want to close with a story that was told to me, or our class, by my 6th grade Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Celine, about competition in a way. And it was from the Bible and the Gospel of Mark. And it goes like this. One day, Jesus sat down opposite the temple alms box with his disciples and watched the people putting money into that box. A great many rich people put in large coins. Then a poor widow came up and dropped in 2 little coins, worth together about half a penny. Jesus called his disciples to his side and he said to them, believe me, this poor widow has put in more than all the others, for they all have put in what they could easily afford. But she, in her poverty, who needs so much, has given away nearly everything. The point of the story is, of course, that a true winner is the one who gives the most relative to what they have. May this be the standard we uphold for ourselves and for other people on this Super Bowl Sunday. So may it be.